The woman everyone whispered was homeless stood beside me in a borrowed blue dress, her hands trembling so badly that I almost told her we should leave. Then she looked toward the front row of my ex-wife's wedding, stopped breathing for a second, and quietly whispered that the man smiling beside the groom had destroyed her life 15 years ago. I thought bringing her here would simply prove that kindness still existed after my divorce. I had no idea I was about to expose a lie so enormous that it would stop an entire wedding before the vows were even spoken. Before we begin, if you believe in kindness, forgiveness, and second chances, please like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone you care about, and subscribe for more heartfelt stories. Your support helps us bring more inspiring stories to life. 3 months before that unforgettable afternoon, I believed my life had already reached its lowest point. My name is Nolan Mercer, and after 12 years of marriage, my wife, Brielle, walked away with a simple explanation that somehow hurt more than 1,000 cruel words ever could. She said she no longer recognized the man she had married. I wanted to argue, but deep inside I realized I didn't recognize myself either. My career had consumed me. I spent more time chasing promotions than sharing dinners, more time answering emails than asking my wife how she truly felt. By the time I finally slowed down, she had already packed her memories into cardboard boxes and left behind nothing except silence. The divorce wasn't explosive. There were no screaming matches or shattered dishes. That almost made it worse. Two people who had once dreamed together simply signed papers, exchanged polite smiles, and became strangers. When the invitation to her wedding arrived only 10 months later, I almost threw it into the trash. Instead, I stared at it for hours. She was marrying Everett Calloway, a wealthy investment consultant whose confidence filled every room. I remembered meeting him once during the final months of our marriage. At the time, Brielle insisted they were only business acquaintances. Maybe that had been true. Maybe it hadn't. I no longer had the strength to investigate ghosts. A week before the ceremony, I found myself volunteering at a neighborhood outreach center, mostly because I couldn't stand sitting alone in my apartment listening to memories echo off the walls. That was where I met the woman everyone called Vivian. Nobody knew her last name. She rarely spoke. She arrived every morning carrying a worn backpack and always offered to clean tables before accepting breakfast herself. Some volunteers assumed she suffered from mental illness. Others believed addiction had ruined her life. I noticed something different. Every movement she made carried unusual grace. She thanked everyone with perfect manners. She folded blankets with military precision. Even the way she held a coffee cup suggested she had once belonged somewhere very different. One afternoon, while helping organize donated clothing, I accidentally dropped an old family photograph from her backpack. She picked it up so quickly that tears escaped before she could hide them. In the picture stood a smiling little girl between Vivian and a man wearing a firefighter's uniform. She quietly admitted the girl had been her daughter. When I gently asked where she was now, Vivian answered with heartbreaking honesty. She didn't know. Years earlier, after her husband died during a warehouse fire, she became involved in a financial fraud investigation. A respected businessman accused her of stealing charity funds intended for firefighters' families. Newspapers published her face before any evidence was examined. Employers stopped calling. Friends disappeared. Her house was seized while legal fees consumed everything else. Later, prosecutors quietly dropped every criminal charge because the money had actually vanished through another company. By then the damage was irreversible. Her daughter had entered temporary foster care during the investigation and eventually disappeared into another state through a complicated adoption process. Vivian spent years searching until hope itself became too expensive. Something about her story unsettled me. Not because it sounded impossible. Because it sounded painfully believable. When I asked why she never fought harder to clear her name, she simply smiled with exhausted eyes and said that once enough people decide you're guilty, innocence becomes the loneliest place in the world. Those words stayed with me. The day before Brielle's wedding, I returned to the shelter carrying several bags of donated clothing. Vivian thanked me, but I could see she was preparing to leave. Funding cuts meant several residents had to move elsewhere. Without fully understanding why, I heard myself asking whether she would accompany me to a wedding the following afternoon. She looked confused. I explained that attending alone felt unbearable and that maybe two lonely people could survive an awkward afternoon better than one broken man. For several seconds she simply stared at me before laughing for what seemed like the first time in years. The borrowed blue dress fit surprisingly well after one of the volunteers adjusted the hem. Another volunteer styled Vivian's silver-streaked hair, revealing elegance that hardship had never completely erased. When she looked into the mirror, tears filled her eyes because she said she hadn't recognized herself in almost a decade. The ceremony took place at a beautiful vineyard outside the city, where sunlight stretched across endless green hills and white roses lined the pathway toward an outdoor altar. Guests wore expensive suits, sparkling jewelry, and effortless smiles. As Vivian stepped from my car, several curious glances immediately landed on her. She noticed, lowered her head, and whispered that perhaps coming had been a mistake. I assured her that kindness never required permission. We walked together toward the seating area. Then everything changed. Vivian suddenly froze. Her breathing became uneven. Her hands started shaking uncontrollably. She stared toward the front row where an older gentleman adjusted his silk tie while greeting arriving guests with polished confidence. Without taking her eyes off him, Vivian quietly said that he was the one. I asked who. She whispered his name. Graham Holloway. According to Vivian, Graham had managed the firefighter charity that supposedly lost its funds. He had publicly accused her before reporters, claiming she manipulated financial records. His testimony destroyed her reputation overnight. My stomach tightened. Because Graham Holloway wasn't just another wedding guest. He was Everett's father. The music began. Guests settled into elegant white chairs. Vivian begged me not to create a scene, insisting nobody would believe her anyway. But something inside me refused to stay silent. Maybe my failed marriage had finally taught me that avoiding difficult truths only allows bigger lies to survive. As everyone stood for the bride's entrance, I noticed Graham laughing comfortably with several community leaders. They praised his decades of charitable work. Cameras flashed around him. Meanwhile, the woman he had publicly blamed stood invisible only 20 feet away. Life can be unbelievably cruel. The ceremony started beautifully. Brielle looked radiant walking beneath bright summer skies, and despite everything between us, I genuinely hoped she would find happiness. Yet my attention kept returning to Vivian. She wasn't watching the bride. She was watching Graham with quiet terror. Halfway through the officiant's opening remarks, a young woman hurried toward the front row carrying a folder. She whispered something into Graham's ear. His expression changed instantly. He looked nervous. He stood and walked toward the reception building. Without thinking, I followed him. Inside a quiet hallway, I watched from around the corner as the young woman handed Graham several old documents. I caught only fragments of their conversation. She mentioned archived audit reports. She mentioned journalists requesting interviews. Then she said the sentence that made my blood run cold. The original records had finally been found. Graham grabbed the folder with visible panic. When the young woman walked away, he quickly opened the papers. Several sheets slipped onto the floor. One landed near my feet. I picked it up. Across the top appeared the logo of the Firefighter Foundation. Near the bottom sat a signature authorizing transfers into a private investment account. The signature wasn't Vivian's. It belonged to Graham Holloway. He looked up. Our eyes met. For one endless moment neither of us moved. Then he demanded the document back, insisting I had misunderstood. But fear had already replaced confidence in his voice. Outside, Wedding guests wondered why the ceremony had paused. Inside, 15 years of buried truth began collapsing. I returned to the ceremony carrying the document. Vivian immediately recognized the signature. She started crying before I said a single word. The officiant attempted to continue, but Graham interrupted, insisting everything was under control. Unfortunately for him, the young woman from earlier suddenly appeared again, followed by 2 investigative journalists who had been invited to the wedding by another guest. Apparently they had been researching financial irregularities involving several old charities. The recovered audit records connected everything. One by one, additional documents surfaced. Witnesses stepped forward. Former employees admitted they had remained silent because Graham's influence threatened their careers. The fraud investigation that ruined Vivian had never truly ended. It had simply been buried beneath money, reputation, and time. The vineyard became eerily silent. Brielle looked back and forth between her future father-in-law and the crying woman standing beside me. Everett demanded explanations from his father. None came. Instead, Graham quietly sat down as if decades of pretending had suddenly become too heavy to carry. Police investigators who had already been reviewing the reopened case arrived shortly afterward to collect evidence. No dramatic chase followed. No loud confession echoed across the vineyard. Sometimes justice arrives not with explosions but with exhausted surrender. The wedding ended before vows were exchanged. Guests slowly drifted away in stunned silence. I expected Brielle to blame me for ruining her day. Instead, she approached Vivian first. She gently held her shaking hands and apologized for every cruel article she had believed years earlier. Vivian cried harder than before because she said hearing one sincere apology felt like breathing fresh air after living underwater for 15 years. As the afternoon continued, another astonishing truth emerged. The young woman who had delivered the audit folder earlier introduced herself. Her name was Elise. She worked as a financial researcher reviewing nonprofit archives. While helping investigators reconstruct old adoption records connected to families affected by the charity scandal, she had unknowingly discovered something extraordinary only days earlier. She looked at Vivian with tears already falling. Then she quietly revealed that she herself had once been named Lily before entering foster care. Vivian stopped moving. The photograph from the backpack flashed through my mind. The little girl between her parents. The same gentle eyes. The same smile. Years of paperwork, sealed records, and legal confusion had kept mother and daughter apart without either realizing they had lived only 2 states away for most of their lives. There wasn't a single dry eye left among those still standing at the vineyard. They embraced beneath bright afternoon sunlight while generations of pain dissolved into tears neither of them had believed they would ever share again. I stood several steps away, unable to speak. For the first time since my divorce, I understood that broken endings sometimes exist only because better beginnings are waiting beyond them. Several weeks later, Graham Holloway officially faced criminal charges connected to fraud, obstruction, and falsified evidence. More importantly, Vivian's name was publicly cleared. Newspapers that once destroyed her reputation printed front-page apologies. They couldn't return 15 stolen years, but they finally returned her dignity. Elise invited Vivian to move into her home while they slowly learned how to become mother and daughter again instead of strangers connected only by tragedy. Healing wasn't immediate. Lost birthdays could never be replaced. Empty holidays remained painful memories. But every shared breakfast, every afternoon walk, and every conversation built something stronger than regret. As for Brielle, she quietly ended her engagement to Everett, not because of anything Everett had done, but because she realized how easily appearances had blinded all of them. Months later we met for coffee, not as husband and wife hoping for another chance, but as 2 people finally mature enough to forgive each other. We wished one another happiness and meant every word. I often visited Vivian and Elise. Their home slowly filled with photographs replacing the empty years that had once haunted them. Every picture reminded me that kindness offered without expecting anything in return can quietly reshape entire lives. Sometimes people ask whether I regret bringing a woman everyone assumed was homeless to my ex-wife's wedding. Never. Because I didn't bring shame into that ceremony. I brought truth. And truth has an extraordinary way of finding exactly the place where it has been missing the longest. Speech balloon special request: before the story ends, tell us in the comments, what would you have done if you were in this situation? If this story touched your heart, please like, comment, share, and subscribe for more meaningful and inspiring stories. Your support encourages us to keep creating stories that touch hearts around the world. Life has a remarkable way of hiding miracles inside moments that first look like disasters. The person the world ignores may be carrying a truth powerful enough to change countless lives. Never judge someone's worth by their appearance, never let another person's reputation become your evidence, and never underestimate the healing power of kindness, forgiveness, and second chances. Sometimes the smallest act of compassion opens the door to the greatest redemption of all.